to Victor, sir. I can see he has turned on his camera, he's turned off that mute button, etc. And now he is sharing his slides. So we've got Vitor Correia from Intraw, who has given us the fairly emotive title, I think, Victor, that's all that can be said here, of Diplomacy versus Military Force. Who will win? So Victor, round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, for Victor, and over to yourself. Thank you very much, Victor.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you again for organizing this conference on the ESG, which I believe is very useful to everyone working on the mineral raw materials value chain. My background is on geology. I also work on management for a couple of years, and I'm serving as Secretary General of the International Raw Materials Observatory. And the observatory itself, it positions as an honest broker, meaning that we try to collect information on many different aspects that can come from the, let's say, from the economic side, or from the political side, or from the cultural or any other social constraint, and any factor that might in fact have an impact on mineral raw materials. And I'm trying to bring this perspective to this conference, because it's not only about ESGs, but it's about how the, let's say, the environmental context can impact the work that you are doing. The outline of the presentation has 3 points, and I'll jump directly to trade and power, because as we all know, trade was linked to, and resources trade in particular, has been always linked to the industry needs. And whenever this trade was blocked, at least until recently in the past, what nations used to do was to resort to warfare. And a great example was the beginning of the well, it was the invasion of Manchuria by Japan, and that was the seed for the beginning of the Second World War. But also coming from the Second World War, we had the creation of the European Community for Steel and Coal, and that was a change, because in a way it brought to the table this soft power approach, because soft power, unlike hard power that is based on coercion, soft power brings up this idea of co-opt and attract. And this is different. Of course, we can argue that we had that before with the League of Nations, and in a way also with the United Nations. But this was if you want, the foundation of the European Union, and that has provided several decades of peace in Europe. If you look now to raw materials, the industry and market size, and if you organize the countries according to this classification of having, let's say, a great geological endowment and the size of the market, then you begin to understand how development strategies have developed. So raw materials, when raw materials are abundant, and if there is a small market, what you find is normally raw materials producing countries. And the examples in the graphic of Australia, Canada, and Chile illustrate this very well. On the other side, if you don't have raw materials, and if you have a big market, or if you used to have raw materials, like it's the case of Europe, but for the time being you are not extracting them, then you have these market-driven economies, the examples, Japan and Europe. And the worst case scenario, you don't have raw materials and you are a small country, either you go to some sort of specialization in services like it happened with Switzerland, or you are facing difficulties because you don't have this source of wealth. And again, the best case scenario, you have raw materials and you have a big nation. It used to be only the United States. Now China is also coming to this new scenario. Then if you look to the way countries used to relate themselves in this context, you see what normally happens is that these raw materials producing countries, they tend to have some sort of market couple, and this coupling with these different, if you want, with the selected partners You can see it very clearly in Australia and in Canada. Australia, they used to partner with Japan, but then with the rise of China, these days, roughly 80% of the exports of Australia go to China. And in the case of Canada, the main destination for their exports is the United States. I'm talking, of course, about raw materials exports, minerals, raw materials. But if you don't have these mineral raw materials, as the case of Europe, of Japan, then you need to resort to other strategies. The case of Japan is a good one because there is this top-down approach coming from the state of trying to figure out how can we find minerals, of securing minerals. And JOCMEC, the Japanese association, is organization doing that. It's a government organization, is very active on that because they put together all the different parts of the equation, and they try to help their domestic companies in a very proactive way. At the same time, the Japanese are also among the best in the world in recycling. Of course, they can only recycle what exists in their internal market. And because they are an exporting nation, they also need mineral raw materials, primary mineral raw materials. So recycling is not enough for their needs. In the case of Europe, Europe is basically using trade, if you want, as their big lever. So trade, and if you look to the raw materials policy, you see that trade is coming with the ensure level playing field and access to resources, and then in small, the same size circles with I would say with a minor importance, this idea of having domestic sourcing and also resource efficiency and recycling. At the same time, and this is important, the European Union is putting a lot of money on research and innovation. And this is made directly by Horizon 2020, also by the AIT Raw Materials, which is bringing together the triangle of academia, industry, and research. So imagine that you have, you are one of these countries, again in Europe, but you need mineral raw materials. Basically, you have two options. Either you resort to trade or you start investing on domestic supply. And these are the typical problems that you face. Trade brings together this idea of international competition, which is a rising problem because in the past, let's say before 2001, before China entered the World Trade Organization, the supply demand was more or less balanced. So in fact, the demand was smaller than the supply, and now it changed. So nowadays, what's happening is that there's more demand than supply, and that is boosting prices of some mineral raw materials. And this is what we are expecting in the future. But you also have problems with the resources nationalism. When countries decide to put some sort of barriers to trade or to create export taxes because they want to increase the added value of the ores they are exporting. And in some cases, you also have dumping. On the domestic supply side, at least in Europe, these are the major problems that we have. I mean, the deposits that we have been exploited in the past. So what we have now are low grades and smaller deposits. The extraction costs tend to be higher. And of course, there is a strong problem with what we call the social license to operate, basically a lot of public opposition. And the solutions to that, the ones that are normally being developed, in the case of trade, are of course economic diplomacy, all this cooperation on different areas, and also the development of, if you want, tariff and non-tariff barriers, sort of penalties. And this is where I will place standards and the ESG. So in a way, what we are telling countries is that if you are not performing well enough, you'll be facing some sort of barrier, as it was just mentioned about aluminium. So this comes into a way of, let's say, trying to highlight the best practice and to favor them. On the domestic supply, I was using these three different tools that are being used curb these problems, dialogues, and I included into commerce persuasion after hearing yesterday's communication from Jens Stewart, because I believe it's still what happens in many cases, is that we try to persuade communities that a mine is good for them. And of course, money and a lot of investment on research and development. Going quickly through this, for instance, the European Union is basically using trade as the big leverage. What you see in green are all these free trade agreements, and you see that what Europe aims to have is a lot of options, because the more options you have, the more bargain power you will be having. At the same time, the European Union is investing in research and innovation, and this European Raw Materials Alliance is a good example of that, bringing many different stakeholders. If you look to the United States, the approach is completely different. I mean, the United States, they have this power. If you want, they have this hard power because they have the military capacity, and basically they can create a trade war. And at the same time, because they have a big market, they can use this realpolitik approach. And what they are doing, this is news from a couple of weeks ago, what they are doing now, working together with Canada and Australia, is using that, basically bringing together the partners they used to work with. The Chinese, I believe these are also important players. What the Chinese are doing is completely different. Until now, basically, they were using diplomacy, all this economic diplomacy, and this Silk Road, or the Belt and Road approach from China is in a way an illustration of that. They are basically working with neighboring countries, developing infrastructure. Of course, we can argue that there's a price for that, but in fact, the Chinese are doing it, and it's if you want, is a sort of economic diplomacy. But at the same time, the Chinese are also using a solution that they call strategic delay. Basically, what they are doing, and the example here are from the boats in the South China Sea, is that they are trying to claiming that these areas belong to them, and then they are using this strategic delay approach to, let's say, to cover their expansionist aims. And in fact, the reason why apparently they are in the South Sea China is because that was a report from it has 2 or 3 weeks, is that there are mineral raw materials, so some metallic nodules with rare earths in that region. The Chinese also have another advantage. They don't face public opposition, they don't have cost problem, and they haven't depleted their biggest deposit. So in a way, they are better positioned than the others. And whatever is the future, I believe the solution will be outlined in this hard power versus soft power line. And to illustrate that, you see that the United States still have a strong military presence abroad, all over the world, meaning that they can resort to hard power whenever they need. And the Chinese, they used to be on the soft power side, together with the European Union and the Japanese, basically trying to use economic diplomacy to obtain the raw materials they look for, but they are now moving quickly to the hard power side of this line. And this, of course, is, if you want, something that should worry us. I believe, however, that we have grounds for optimism, and basically for 3 reasons. The first one is the geological endowment. No nation has all the minerals or all the raw materials that a sophisticated industry needs. So this brings the idea that we always need trade. The second factor is that if you look to this technology driving force, we are using more raw materials than ever before, meaning that, again, trade is the only solution, because you cannot have all the raw materials you need. And finally, a problem that we are facing, and this is climate change. It's also a driver of change. Climate change is, in a way, a problem that can only be solved by cooperation. And by bringing this idea of cooperation, I believe this will be in the soft power side of the line. And this is all from my side. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. If you want to have more insights on these, let's say, distant factors that might impact the raw materials value chain, have a look at the World Barometer in the website of Intraw. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Victor. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for a big round of applause from the fabulous, for the fabulous Vitor Correia. That was absolutely brilliant. Thanks, Victor.
Thank you
Firstly, of course, please do feel free to go and check out the Intraw's World Barometer that's there, and we'll make sure all the links are freely available to everybody. Secondly, Victor, as somebody who is, of course, based in Scotland, actually, so maybe we're closer to Europe than the rest of the UK. I don't know what's going on there at the moment. And of course, this time last year was pre-Brexit. Now we are post-Brexit. So just again, while waiting for the questions to come in, from the United Kingdom's perspective, there's been an awful lot of conversation over the last 12 months about what should the British strategy be in terms of raw materials, because of course until the beginning of last year we were very much part of Europe. Given your overview of different approaches just now, do you have any suggestions as to what the British strategy should be? And be polite, Victor.
Well, my perception is that the British still have a strong military structure. So you see that in these recent confrontations in the South Sea China, one of the countries that deployed war vessels there was the UK. So you still have that capacity, but I'm not seeing the UK go into any sort of conflict with China, because that doesn't make sense. At the same time, the UK normally use this economic diplomacy in a very active way. I do remember that the UK was very active doing diplomacy with Russia, for instance. Nowadays, if you want, this diplomatic situation is not so it's not so good as it used to be. But I do believe that UK, with time, will be using more soft power. And realizing that the hard power solution is not good enough, because you cannot solve these big problems that we are all facing collectively in isolation.
I'm very glad that you haven't just said that we should go to war with China, Victor. I'm very relieved by that at this precise second in time. There's a great question that's actually come in from Ludovine here in the chat, and she asks, do you see the strong connection between the Critical Raw Materials Initiative and the EU Green Deal as a sign of this policy shift, i.e. will others follow the EU's lead, for example, the US?
I believe a lot will depend on timing. The US are already having that approach. I mean, the Democrats are pushing these infrastructure investments, and together with that, there is a strong there is a lot of money for the energy transition. But the point is that, at least my perception is that it depends on timing, because the country that is best positioned right now to be the first one to be climate neutral is clearly China, because they have the market, they have the technology, they have the raw materials. And if if you want, in that competition for who will going to be the first, I believe the Chinese will be perfectly positioned, and they also have this big advantage of not having internal opposition. I mean, it's a different political system. So what we are trying to do in Europe is to show to communities that raw materials are needed for the energy transition, but at the same time, the message that policymakers are passing is that we are not going against people. So this creates like a difficult to solve dilemma. And of course, I believe that we are still relying on trade, assuming that we'll be sourcing the raw materials we need from South America or from Europe, but this isn't going to be so easy. So it depends a lot on the timing. Assuming that we'll have time enough, I believe we can position ourselves and be leaders in that. If not, I believe we'll be followers.
Brilliant. So with that, thank you very, very much, Victor. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for another round of applause for the brilliant Victor.